Okay, and welcome to our lecture on realism. So realism, like other styles that we'll study, overlaps with Romanticism. And this movement is a reaction to several moments in history. So the Industrial Revolution, which changes society at large. We have people who are moving to the cities. You have, of course, new industries. But with that, you have extremely crowded conditions. You have a rise in crime. You have people in abject poverty that are more visible because they're all crowded together in cities. You have certain people getting richer who own these factories. Like I said, there's an increase in crime, so consider the reaction to that. And so, just like other times in history, artists are looking for answers to the meaning of life, the meaning to these changes. And so the art changes to reflect that. We also have the real creation of photography at this point. Your two assigned resources are about that. I'm not going to focus on it as much because you have the assigned resources. But consider how we've studied art, and a major component of Western art is trying to create realistic images on a two-dimensional canvas. Well, here we go. Here is an extremely realistic image on a flat two-dimensional picture. So this mission is accomplished. The aims of creating a realistic looking work of art on a flat surface is done. So what do you now do? This goal of many artists can now be achieved with photography. So styles will change to reflect that as well. This is Still Life in Studio, a daguerreotype. It is by Daguerre, where he's taking a still life photo. We've looked at numerous still lifes in the history of art, primarily oiled on canvas. And so here he has these different textures all displayed, different images. There's also an argument of vanitas throughout it, through the angelic figurines, the typical goddess, Greek goddess, nude female here, the two putti angels. And so the idea of how life is fleeting. So again, the invention of photography. Our civil war is occurring at this time. We have numerous philosophies that come about, just like how we studied with the Enlightenment period and how that greatly affected art. And so these are attempts to understand life and society, theories about how to live, how humans should function, how society should function. And so one of the major philosophies at this point is Karl Marx's communism with the Communist Manifesto. And so we went into that with China, but consider how, it emerged during this time period to really address the huge gap between the people who are experiencing abject poverty and the owners of these factories, if you will. And so he sees the world between the oppressed and the oppressor, and how the oppressed, the proletariat, must rise up with arms to create a new world. Of course, he doesn't really acknowledge human nature, or during this point, people from the very bottom are rising up. But he is reacting to the real issues that are occurring, the real increase in crime and the real extremely visible poverty that's going on. And so numerous artists during this realism period are influenced by that idea. And so then we start to see attention being given for really the first time on a official art scale, bringing it into the view of fine arts, is we start to see the poor depicted, such as the gleaners. Another philosophy that comes about is by Auguste Comte, is this idea of, it's called empiricism. And so this is really, he kind of has different positivism, etc. But essentially it's the idea that realist artists think that knowledge is based on observance through your senses. And so what we're going to see with these realism artists is that they're depicting what they see in that moment. Okay, we're not looking to the past. We're not looking to these epic histories. We're not looking to emotion anymore as a means of figuring out the world and solving the social issues around us. Instead, we're going to just paint what's in front of us. with the lens of more of this Marxist theory of drawing attention to those who haven't been on display at museums. Museums aren't really around yet. The Salon and the Academy of Arts. And so this is Jean-Francois Millet's The Gleaners. More of a transition piece, because we'll see in a few moments how realism creates more realistic images. And Millet depicts idealized agricultural workers. The gleaners. So the gleaners are the ones who go through after the harvest has already been done, and they pick up the pieces. This is back-breaking work. This bending over, you're carrying these heavier loads once you accumulate more of these leftover pieces of the grain, etc. It's really hard labor. You're picking up the leftovers. And so we have these workers, the gleaners, depicted here. But notice how they are idealized. They're white clothing. Their light clothing doesn't look dirty. There's no tears or really any dirt, essentially, on any of their clothing. And so he elevates this idea of the gleaners. But this is a big deal because he's drawing attention to those who haven't been depicted in art before. And he's elevating their status. There's this idea of bringing what would be low themes to high themes. So consider our hierarchy of painting, which we've studied, in which history paintings are at the top of this hierarchy. You have portraiture, you have still lifes, you have landscapes, and on the bottom you have these genre scenes of normal everyday life. Realism flips that upside down, and where they're trying to elevate these normal people, normal images, genre scenes, to the level of fine art. Consider how the same argument was going with photography. And so Gustave Courbet is our key artist for realism. When you think realism, I want you to think of Courbet. Just like when you think of Romanticism, I want you to think of the Medusa by Géricault. Now, this was created in 1849. Note the date. It was destroyed in 1945. Unfortunately, this is one of the images which was destroyed at the end of World War II, likely by Hitler, in which he had captured many artworks. And at the end of the war, when he knew he was losing, he had his soldiers destroy many of these artworks. At one point, he had even ordered a colonel to destroy Paris as a whole, and he refused. Thank goodness. But unfortunately, this is one of those images lost to history. But we do have many photos of it. And so here we have the Stonebreakers. Consider how different this is than other artworks that we've studied. This is a massive painting. Remember, massive paintings were only reserved for these history paintings, because that's the top of the hierarchy. The bigger the painting, the more important. But he creates this very large-scale painting of a subject matter that hasn't been depicted in art. So he wanted to bring this contemporary subject matter of what's occurring right now, of what you can see with your senses. And he wants to elevate it to the idea of fine art. So he finds the Marxist philosophy particularly appealing. And because he sees the terrible conditions in which these workers are working and where it seems like there's no way out, as depicted by the younger boy and the older man, and how there seems to be this cycle going on. And of course, like many philosophies, you disregard certain aspects of human nature. The idea of even these major industry or owners of industry can fall out just as easily as others, like famous names that we don't really hear of much. Like you may have heard of the Vanderbilts. They were built a fortune upon transportation and the railroad system, but now you don't really hear about them. Essentially, the ancestors of modern day are just normal middle-class people. And other examples of major industries or major companies going under and new ones rising up with new ideas. Many people creating these new inventions in which then factories arise to build these new inventions, etc. But for the most part, I mean, a massive part of the population is suffering. And so you watched a video over that of real poverty. And we see that here. Okay, so let's analyze the painterly aspects of this. Our color palette has changed from Romanticism, right? We have this lighter color palette, more of these earthy tones, and consider how the brush strokes have changed. They aren't as loose, but we have this contour line surrounding our figures, this outline to them. Now, remember how I talked about how hands are an important skill, depicting hands is an important skill of the artist. Consider how portraiture is a depiction of faces, so that's an important skill. Whereas here, we don't see the boy's face, we don't see his hands so much. We do see this gentleman's hands, but we don't really see his face. In fact, just as much attention is given to the rocks and given to that surrounding them as it is to the individuals, to the figures. He's trying to elevate their status, and he's trying to shine a light on what hasn't been depicted in art. They're arguing, essentially these realist artists, such as Courbet, are arguing that only the contemporary world, what we see, is real. We're not going to base this on emotions that you can't see. We're not going to base our understanding of the world solely on previous philosophies that hadn't worked out. Instead, we're going to focus on what is real, what is in front of us, what are the events of our own time. They disapprove of historical and fictional subjects. Instead, they want what is visible and present in this moment. So that's the idea of this empiricism. This is back-breaking labor. And look how much more realistic he depicts these laborers. They do have holes in their outfits. They do have these patches. This likely teenager looks too young to be carrying this heavy load of rocks. He's having to use so much of his body to even lift it up. And this gentleman on the right, we can tell that he's aged, that he should be retired, but he's still working this breaking up of the stone as sustenance for his family. And so the age difference also helps to create this idea of this argument of this continuous cycle. Notice how also the background behind them, how there's only this glimmer of the sky beyond them. So there's this sense of isolation, of entrapment, in which he's really commenting on. So he has rejected the normal subject matter of art. He has rejected the normal skill or what's prioritized in art. And this really flips the art world upside down. Many argue that this is the beginning of modernism. Some art historians will argue that modern art begins with the Impressionists. Others will argue it begins now because we're depicting contemporary events, contemporary people in a non-idealized way, which is funny because then this idea of Okay, so I want to introduce this concept of avant-garde. And this derives from, fiction is more of a military term. So back in the day, you would go to war and your soldiers would line up. And the other side, soldiers would line up into these rows. And then they would essentially walk toward each other and destruction occurs. The avant-garde is the first line in which their purpose is to break up the other side's line, to cause chaos, to break them up for destruction. And so avant-garde is this idea of breaking up the norm. And so with the art world, this is where you're rejecting the art institution, where you're breaking up these norms of the art institution. And so we see that beginning with the stonebreakers and up through the many styles. So much so that initially it was a rejection of the art institution, but now what's funny is the art institution is based on avant-garde. All of these new modern artworks are how much more can you reject a norm, etc. And so it's funny how things work out that way. But here is the stonebreakers. Okay, here is his burial at Ornans, another extremely massive piece. Now, what's different about this one is we have more everyday people depicted of all ages, more of middle or lower class, in the burial of someone who doesn't seem to have any status. There's no reference to his whoever is being buried, to the deceased. He actually had individuals come, or he based these off of real individuals. So they're essentially portraits of real people. Because again, with realism, you're depicting what you can see. So he is depicting people that were visible, that he could see. And Ornans is a small little town. And so this is likely, it's not have a lot of upper class people here. And so this likely represents some type of funeral that he did attend. So again, this realism of this contemporary subject matter. There's no epic event going on here. There's no historical event. There's no imaginative event. In fact, consider how the previous style, Romanticism, if they were going to depict a burial, they probably would have made it extremely dramatic. People crying and mourning and ripping out their hair as they're mourning and shrieking and just overly dramatic. Whereas here, it's a much more realistic depiction, right? Realism. They're rejecting that imaginative emotionalism of Romanticism. They're doing so purposefully. And here we have Edouard Manet, extremely avant-garde. Sometimes he is associated with the Impressionists. However, he's older than the Impressionists. They come next with the next generation. He ends up being pretty much like a mentor to them. So he starts it. But he's part of this realism movement where he is depicting contemporary subject matter. We see these gentlemen in contemporary clothing. So this is a large-scale painting, and it was completely rejected by the Salon. It was seen as too risque. It was entirely rejected. It was essentially an uproar. But this changes the art world, because then all these individuals, particularly many of these realism artists who were rejected by the official Salon, throw their own salon, their own exhibition. The Salon des Refusés, seen as like the Salon of Rejects, which brings more patrons in. So they have so many more people attend to their salon versus the official salon. So this indicates that the people wanted a change as well. Before I get into the details of this painting, I'm skipping ahead here. Here is one of the official artworks of the Salon of Paris, Alexandre Cabanel. And as you can see, our female nude has hit a point of almost seeming vulgar. It's just too erotic. The Birth of Venus. Have a female nude, stick some angels in there, give it a goddess name, and oh, you're good. And so we see that here. In fact, this is a depiction of his mistress, who was well known and recognizable. I mean, it's on the point of gross, even so much so that here's a cartoon from this period in which these females are commenting, not another Venus, there's too many Venuses. So it's always female nudes that are everywhere. And again, on this point of just being vulgar. And so when Edouard Manet depicts this, he's like, well, what's wrong with this female nude? I'm modeling it off of even famous artists of Raphael. Previous artists, Titian or Giorgione, the Pastoral Concert, have depicted female nudes with gentlemen of contemporary clothing out in the pastoral landscape. So why is this one rejected? And so this flips the institution of art upside down, because it's extremely popular. It's much more popular than the artworks chosen by the Salon. And so it questions their authority. And this helps to change the entire art world, essentially. Notice how we have looser brush strokes throughout this painting. You'll see how that leads into Impressionism next. And he's blatantly rejecting the norm of depicting a female nude. We know that because her contemporary clothing is around her. She's just taken it off. He's not trying to make the claim, oh, this is some goddess. There's no reference to any type of Greco-Roman goddess throughout here. It is a contemporary female. So what was a norm during this time period was, especially of the upper class, is having a mistress. It wasn't really frowned upon. It's just a social norm, but you don't depict that, talk about it. And so here we have what are likely two prostitutes. We'll get to another artwork in which it was somewhat common for upper class gentlemen to visit brothels. But we have likely two prostitutes here out for lunch with these upper class gentlemen. And she's looking directly at the viewer, and she's gazing at them. Now, it's not in an inviting way. Consider how different this is than our Venus of Urbino. She's not like sprawled out inviting the viewer. She seems to have been just in conversation and momentarily interrupted as she looks at the viewer. So there isn't even this real sexual notion here versus what the female nudes at the salon had become. We also have this other individual in white clothing leaning over. And so these aspects of a contemporary female nude flip the art world upside down. There's no classical excuse here, in other words. He also created Olympia, which is going to influence many artists from here on out. And let's come back to our Venus of Urbino and how different this artwork is. So remember with our Venus of Urbino, how she was sprawled out? And in this inviting, alluring look to her, she had the loyal dog at the end of the bed. So here we have this black cat. So black cat, of course, isn't loyal. Consider the connotation of witches or independence of these black cats. This is Olympia. So that may initially sound like some type of Greco-Roman reference. Oh, we're using that as an excuse to depict a female nude. But actually, this was the common name for a prostitute during this time. So what we're looking at here, Manet is depicting a prostitute and blatantly saying so. Again, and this was a pretty normal activity for gentlemen of many walks of life, is to visit brothels. But it's not talked about. It's not depicted in art. It's not shown. But he's showing it because he's showing what is real, what is contemporary, what is happening, what is visible with our senses. And he's playing specifically off of our Venus of Urbino, even with the green velvet curtain behind her, with the servant over on the right. Remember the two servant girls in the Venus of Urbino. And here she is presenting this bouquet of flowers, likely from a regular patron of this Olympia. Notice how, again, her hand is also covering up where her genitals are, but she's in a much more almost, I don't want to say tense position, but in this position of where she's ready for business, right? She's alert, she's ready, because this is her occupation. She also seems somewhat washed out, right? We have our contour line. Manet's using the same as our Courbet. But the color palette, especially against this white, the white sheets, is she looks somewhat washed out. She's wearing this jewelry, shoes, and that's pretty much it. So she's frank, she's direct, she's uncaring. There's this really unnerving aspect to it compared to other depictions of nudes in art, of female nudes, where she has this cold and uninviting look. She just means is extremely different. Again, because he's actively rejecting these norms of the art institution. This was presented with, he tried to present this for the Salon of 1865, 2 years later. It was considered a scandal. Notice how also like the bottom of her feet are slightly dirty. So that was gross. There's also this somewhat greenish aspect to the outline. She has a little bit of these bloodshot eyes. The cloth that she's laying on, perhaps a robe, is just haphazardly underneath her. And it was described even by critics as like the apostle of the ugly and repulsive. He completely departs from the academic style. We have these rougher brush strokes. We have this subject matter which is not to be shown. And so many consider him to be the first truly modernist painter, Manet. But he's deliberately shocking. He's really trying to reimagine what art can be. and commenting on modern society. He's bringing to light what people don't want to bring to light. She's not meant to be viewed in private, like our Venus of Urbino. She's not meant to be depicted as some type of Greco-Roman goddess, etc. She's not a mythological figure. She is, in fact, a prostitute, which was common to the upper-class Parisian men. Yeah. She's also not in any type of exotic locale. Think of our Ung painting that we looked at. He's just depicting what is happening, what is real. Realism. Versus the Venus of Urbino. Giorgione Sleeping Venus. Or Le Grand Odalisque. And the differences. Okay. Next is Impressionism.